I'm quite worried about the lasting damage to the university sector. If tens of thousands of staff are kind of, dissipated to the four corners of the country because of these job cuts, even when the borders reopen and universities can get back to, full-scale operation, their people are going to be gone. And that's going to, I think, really damage Australia's research capacity, research and innovation capacity for years to come.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Don't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to talk about one of the industries that has been hit hardest by the pandemic, the university sector.
Australia's international borders closed early last year. The university sector was hit hard. International students disappeared and job cuts started.
Education is Australia's fourth largest export, worth nearly $40 billion to the economy.
International student enrolments are down because of COVID, and there's no guarantee things will go back to normal post-pandemic.
Okay. Universities have been doing it very tough. New South Wales University of New South Wales last week announced it was axing 500 staff. Monash University in Melbourne.
Centre Director Jim Stanford calls it an avoidable catastrophe because public universities didn't qualify for the JobKeeper wage subsidy.
So just how bad is the damage? In a new report called An Avoidable Catastrophe, the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work took a look at the harm caused to this sector and its workers. And today I'm delighted to introduce co-authors of the report, Dr. Jim Stanford, Economist and Director of the Australia Institute Centre for Future Work, and Eliza Littleton, Research Economist at the Australia Institute. G'day, Jim and Eliza. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ebony. Thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Jim, I'll start with you. Before we get into the details of the findings of this report, can you just take us back to the beginning when the pandemic hit? What exactly happened to Australian universities? Why have they been so badly impacted?
Well, one of the first things the Commonwealth government did when we realized what we were dealing with was close the borders. And in retrospect, that was a very good thing to do. It explains why Australia, at least in the first stages of the pandemic, had a very low contagion rate compared to other countries. However, there was an obvious consequence from closing the border, and that is Australia's universities, which depend heavily on international students, were going to suddenly lose a large portion of their revenue and their business, if you like. So what happened was the Australian universities, when the borders closed, immediately lost a lot of the international student registrations and the tuition fees that come with that. At the same time, universities, like anything else in society, were trying to grapple with the logistical challenges of the pandemic in terms of moving to online instruction and putting in place safety protocols at universities and so on and so forth. That was a challenge. But the real killer was the loss of about 1/3 of their revenues. Universities depend on international fees for about 1/3 of their total income. So that was obviously going to spark a predictable crisis in the university sector, and it's still raging. This is the thing. It's actually getting worse, not better.
So, Eliza, take us into the actual figures here. Obviously, as Jim's just explained, the university sector was really hard hit, a bit like tourism, because it's dependent on international visitors, students in this case. How many jobs have been lost in the university sector?
Yeah, as Jim mentioned, Australia's higher education sector has been hit really hard by the pandemic. And in the 12 months leading up to May this year, the sector has lost 40,000 jobs, so public tertiary education jobs. And to put this into perspective, that's almost 1 in 5 jobs from the sector, which is a huge loss for the capacity of our educational institutions, but also for the workers in this sector. And of this 40,000 jobs, an estimated 35,000 of them were in public universities. And as Jim mentioned, these issues still exist for universities, so these job losses are just going to get worse and continue into the latter part of this year.
Yeah, so huge numbers there, 40,000 jobs in total, most of them in public universities. And did you say that was around 1 in 5 jobs have been lost? So
yeah, 1 in 5 jobs.
That's just an absolutely enormous consequence. Jim, how does that compare to other sectors of the economy?
Well, there were other sectors that were hit worse in the beginning. Think of the kind of consumer-facing, hands-on industries. Arts and entertainment and recreation was one of the hardest hit. Hospitality, of course, because restaurants and cafes had to close. The retail sector initially experienced big losses. So in the first phase of it, say in the first 4 to 6 months of the pandemic, there were other industries that were hit harder. But what's unique about the university sector is the bloodletting, if you like, the downsizing has continued to get worse, even as the rest of the economy has reopened. So, of course, we're grappling with these new outbreaks and lockdowns in Victoria and New South Wales. But in general, the Australian economy has mostly recovered from the initial downturn of the pandemic. And universities, on the other hand, the crisis is getting worse. And so we've seen this year, in the second year of the pandemic, this is when the universities really went after cutting their permanent staff and their full-time staff rather than just eliminating some kind of casual or part-time positions. And so the total damage is actually getting worse, not better.
Yeah, and Jim, that's partly, I guess, due to the fact that the universities were really cut out from JobKeeper that was going to a lot of those other sectors that you've mentioned, not so much arts and entertainment, obviously, but JobKeeper helped a lot of companies that were struggling, but universities had no access to that.
Yeah, in theory, they could apply for it, but the rules were set up in such a way that they were effectively excluded. In fact, the government changed the rules of JobKeeper 3 times to keep universities from qualifying because they thought they could save some money and they didn't think universities deserved it for some reason. So they changed the rules in terms of how much of a revenue loss the universities had to have. And they changed the rules in terms of whether the universities had to account for the government-based grants that helped to fund some of the infrastructure at universities. So in the end, public universities didn't get a cent from JobKeeper, and that's very different than other nonprofit service organizations in Australia, which did get a lot of support from JobKeeper. And I think that penny pinching by the Commonwealth government really, in retrospect, was very misplaced. The JobKeeper program ended up costing $60 billion less than the government budgeted. So, in theory, if you're going to say this program is there and it has to serve a function, then you want people to use the program. But they were, excluding universities. And in retrospect, they had all kinds of fiscal room to support universities through this incredible crisis.
Why won't the government consider bringing universities into the JobKeeper scheme?
Well, what we have done is we've guaranteed their funding for domestic enrolments.
So is it enough, Alan Finkel, for the government to just say, well, universities get a lot of government backing already, that funding will remain there, but not do any more and, in fact, keep them out of the JobKeeper program?
Look, it's a genuine concern. People on short-term contracts and casuals are at risk of losing their jobs. The universities are trying as hard as they can. But
they gave up 2% of their pay. They've given up a lot to make this place work. So what we also like to see is no forced redundancies on the table.
Eliza, back to those 40,000 jobs, it's hard to even get your head around how many jobs that actually is. What kind of jobs have been lost? Are they casual jobs, part-time, permanent? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so for sure the job losses haven't been distributed equally across all types of staff and across even gender dimensions. So it definitely has implications for specific pockets of people. So firstly, casual jobs were the targets of job losses early in 2020, which obviously reflects the lack of security that these positions offer to people. And so it allowed for employers to shed staff really quickly and costlessly. which is exactly what happened. So by May 2020, that quarter, nearly 8,000 casual jobs were shed by the sector. And by August 2020, 10,000 casual positions had been lost compared to the same quarter in the previous year. So firstly, casuals bore the brunt of the job losses, but by the end of 2020 and the start of 2021, as Jim mentioned, 90% of the 40,000 jobs lost in the 12 months up to May this year were permanent positions. So we saw initial job losses for casuals, then a lot of job losses for permanents. And this reflects, the kind of contractual commitments of universities and the lack of certainty that they had around, how long the pandemic would last, but also whether they were going to receive support. And when it was clear that they weren't going to receive the support, they did start making these decisions to get rid of permanent staff members. So actually what we're seeing this year is that universities are rehiring some of these casual workers to kind of fill the staffing gap that exists, which suggests there might, this is continuing a trend of casualisation potentially in the sector. But there was also a gendered dimension to these job losses as well. So women experienced a disproportionate share of job cuts in the sector. So of the 41,000 jobs lost in the first half of this year, compared to the same quarter in the previous year, 25,000 job losses were incurred by women. So women held 58% of the jobs in the sector before the pandemic, but made up 61% of the job losses this year. And actually, job growth was slower for women in 2020 as well. So this kind of rounds out the complete picture of the gendered implications of these job losses too. And it's particularly devastating for women, I think, because the tertiary education sector is a relatively feminised sector, and employment in this sector is a really good source of quality jobs that are relatively high paying for women. And so this is kind of something that really undermines women's economic security and well-being, because, this against the backdrop of the gender pay gap and the way that we value feminized industries, which tend to be lower paid and more insecure.
I think that's really interesting, that gender dimension of it. But it does make me think, Jim, of the big picture. That's a huge gutting of a sector that Australia depends on to educate the next generation of workers. It's the home of research and development, of innovation. In a lot of ways, universities are engine rooms of the economy, churning out well-educated people to participate in the workforce. What is going to be the implications, do you think, if the university sector continues to see this type of damage to its sector and without much prospect of recovery?
Universities play a critical economic function anytime. But right now, as we're trying to come out of the pandemic, frankly, they're more important than ever. And that makes it all the more inexplicable to me that the Commonwealth government has just kind of thrown the university sector to the dogs and said, you solve your own problems by yourself. First of all, we are going to see some incredible structural change in our economy. There's some industries that just are not going to come back to where they were before the pandemic. There are a few other industries that are actually doing better than they did before the pandemic. So we're going to need people to move from shrinking industries to growing industries, and that means they're going to need new skills, not just for young people, but even mid-career people who might need to kind of, redirect their career in light of what's happening. So that's one factor. Another factor is we've really understood how important research and science is. In the course of the pandemic, we've appreciated how scientific advice isn't, just to invent new gadgets and new apps for our phones. It's actually to keep us alive and help us understand what's going on in our environment and with healthcare and everything else. So at this particular moment, remember, universities are not just teaching institutions. Frankly, they're even more important as sites of research and investigation. And those functions are really going to be undermined by the gutting of permanent staff that we're seeing. University administrations are trying to pinch pennies right now, given their funding crisis. They're dumping permanent staff. They're hiring cheaper sessional instructors to teach the bare bones courses. But that does mean that sort of core function of universities as sites of research and investigation as well as teaching are going to be sacrificed. So I'm quite worried about the lasting damage to the university sector. If tens of thousands of staff are kind of, dissipated to the four corners of the country because of these job cuts, even when the borders reopen and universities can get back to, full-scale operation, their people are going to be gone. And that's going to, I think, really damage Australia's research capacity, research and innovation capacity for years to come.
To keep creating and disseminating and applying the knowledge, that is actually the key to getting us through the pandemic and to building our economy once it's finished.
I'm worried about the attrition of human capital and talent out of the university sector at the moment, to the extent that becomes, that is sustained. I think that's quite a worry, is to lose human capital. We should be building our human capital.
We need Australians better trained for the jobs businesses are looking to create.
There's been a litany of disasters in the vocational education system.
We've seen TAFEs really decimated all over the country and a big drop in apprenticeship figures as well.
Eliza, you've been talking about mostly the impact on public universities. What about the vocational sector? What's happening to TAFEs? Is the picture similar there or a bit different?
This kind of 40,000 job losses number actually is reflective of the vocational education sector as well, including TAFEs, the public sector specifically. So they make up a smaller portion of the jobs in the public tertiary education sector. And there were, of course, job losses there as well. An interesting dimension to these job losses is that the private sector, the private tertiary education sector, so private universities and private vocational education and training providers, the level of employment in that sector actually increased over this period of time. So 100% of all of the jobs lost in the tertiary education sector were jobs in the public sector.
And another dimension of that, if I can just jump in, is it was private universities who qualified for JobKeeper. There was a handful of private universities who were able to jump through the different hoops and qualify for these funds. So it seems astounding, and I think it does reflect an ideological predisposition by the government that private universities didn't need the help as much, yet they're the ones who got government assistance.
Jim, just to wrap us up, could this have been prevented? What could the government have done and what should it be doing now to repair some of this damage?
Well, obviously we couldn't have predicted the pandemic and we couldn't prevent the damage that was done. I think the decision to close the national border was an important one and the right one and saved a lot of lives. But the question is, once you make a national decision in the interests of, national public health, that's why we did that. You can't then just say, well, anyone who's very deeply damaged by this, too bad, off you go. Yet that's what the government did with the university sector. So it seems that it should have been paired with the decision to close the border would be to support those sectors of society and those organizations which were going to be most immediately and directly impacted. And that starts with the university sector, as well as others like the tourism sector. So they should have given immediate support to the universities. They should have included the universities in JobKeeper. That would have allowed the universities to keep more of the staff on. They should have extended JobKeeper. That was a huge mistake of the government's. Now it's clear to cut back that program long before the pandemic was over. It's not too late to fix. So if the government were to direct some targeted support to universities right now, the universities could recoup those lost jobs, preserve the attachment to their long-term permanent staff, and be ready to jump into full gear once the immediate emergency is over. So I think it's not too late for the government to make this right.
I might just add that we actually calculated what it would cost the Commonwealth government to recoup these jobs that were lost in 2021. And we estimated that by providing $3.75 billion in additional funding to universities per year, until normal teaching and international students could come back, universities could, recoup these jobs and provide workers with the security that they had in their jobs before.
$3.75 billion in the context of JobKeeper and the hundreds of millions of dollars they're shoveling out the door to fossil fuel companies certainly seems like a bargain to keep our university sector going strong.
It actually only represents 1.2% of the total cost that the government has spent in stimulus packages through the COVID pandemic.
Well, that really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? Well, thank you. That's all we have time for today. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 14th of September 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit futurework.org.au for all their latest research, including this paper, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Jim Stanford is at Jimbo Stanford, and Eliza Littleton is at Eliza Littleton. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, get vaccinated as soon as you can, and thanks for listening.